The dust of Redemption Gulch clings to everything, even hope. For Elara, arriving as a mail-order bride, that hope is shattered by a cruel public rejection. She's deemed too tall. But as humiliation burns, the town's quiet sheriff steps from the shadows, offering a proposal that will bind their fates before the sun dips below the stark horizon. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe survival can lead to love, hit like and subscribe for more. This isn't just a story of a sudden marriage, it's about whether two outcasts, bound by necessity, can find belonging in each other's unexpected presence, and if a woman shamed for her stature can finally stand tall in a love she never anticipated. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, it's grown a sigh of relief that Elara felt deep in her own weary bones. Dust, the color of faded buckskin, billowed and settled, coating her dark traveling dress with another layer of the West. She'd clutched the small, worn carpetbag on her lap for so many miles, its contents, a spare dress, her mother's locket, and a dwindling store of courage, her only possessions. Redemption Gulch. The name had sounded like a promise in the neatly penned letters from Mr. Silas Croft. A new beginning, away from the pitying glances and the dwindling prospects back east, where a woman of her height, nearly 6 feet tall, was an oddity, a subject of whispers rather than admiration. Elara straightened her bonnet, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs, and peered through the grimy window. A raw, sun-baked street, flanked by rough-hewn buildings, met her gaze. Men in dusty hats paused, their eyes narrowed against the glare, turning towards the coach. One man, stout and florid-faced, with a garish waistcoat straining over his belly, detached himself from the porch of the mercantile. Mr. Silas Croft, she presumed. He held a daguerreotype, squinting at it, then up at the disembarking passengers. When Elara finally descended, her height made her conspicuous even before she fully straightened. She saw Croft's eyes travel up, his smile faltering, then curdling into a look of profound dismay. He glanced back at the small, demure image in his hand, then back at her towering form. A hush fell over the onlookers. The only sounds were the jingle of harnesses and the dry whisper of the wind. You can't be Miss Elara Stone," Croft stammered, his voice loud in the sudden stillness. Elara's throat tightened. "I am, sir. Mr. Croft." He waved the daguerreotype dismissively. "This picture, it shows a woman of normal proportions." "I specified. I ordered a wife, not a blasted maypole." The words, brutal and public, struck Elara like a physical blow. Heat flooded her face, a painful, prickling tide of shame. Laughter, quickly stifled but unmistakable, rippled through the small crowd. Her dreams of a quiet, respectable life, of a home, crumbled into the ever-present dust. She stood frozen, the carpetbag suddenly a leaden weight. Abandoned. Again. First by life, taking her parents, then by circumstance, leaving her with no prospects, and now, by the man who had promised her a future. "Now, see here, Croft," the stage driver began, a gruff note of disapproval in his voice, but Croft waved him off. "She's not what I paid passage for. She can turn right around and go back where she came from. I'll not be the laughingstock of the territory, saddled with an Amazon." Elara flinched, her gaze dropping to the dusty planks beneath her worn boots. Go back. To what? To whom? There was nothing. The journey had taken every last cent. Then, a new voice, calm and steady as bedrock, cut through the charged air. "That's enough, Croft." Elara looked up, past the leering face of her rejecter, to see a tall man detaching himself from the shadows of the sheriff's office. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, his face unreadable, framed by a sun-weathered hat. A tin star glinted dully on his vest. He wasn't as broad as some of the other men, but there was a lean strength to him, an aura of authority that needed no bluster. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, met hers for a fleeting second, and in them, she saw not ridicule, but something else. Assessment, perhaps. He stopped before Silas Croft, his presence alone seeming to diminish the merchant. "The lady has traveled a long way. You'll show her courtesy, or you'll answer to me." Croft blustered, "Sheriff Thorne, this is a private matter. She ain't what was advertised. She's a woman, alone, in a strange town," Thorne stated, his voice low but carrying. He then turned his gaze fully to Alara. It was direct, unwavering, and strangely, grounding. "Ma'am. Mr. Croft is a fool, and has shown himself to be a man of no honor." Alara could only nod, words caught in her throat. The sheriff continued, his next word sending a shockwave through her, and indeed, through the watching town. "The sun will set in a few hours. You have no place to stay, and a woman alone here faces difficulties. My name is Caleb Thorne. If you'll have me, I'll marry you. Before sunset." A collective gasp went up. Silas Croft's jaw dropped. Alara stared, speechless. Marry him? A stranger? A sheriff who looked as hard and unyielding as the landscape. Yet, what choice did she have? Return to the east, penniless and shamed? Face the uncertain perils of a town like Redemption Gulch alone and unprotected? His offer, shocking as it was a lifeline. Her mind raced, weighing the unknown of this man against the certainty of ruin. His eyes held hers, steady, no hint of mockery, no pity she could discern. Just a flat statement, an offer laid bare. She found her voice, a mere whisper. "Sheriff, you don't even know me." "I know you've been wronged," he replied, his gaze unflinching. "And I know what this town can be. My offer stands. Yes or no, ma'am?" The lights fading. Alara looked at the hostile faces around her, at Croft's smug contempt, and then back to the sheriff. His face was stern, weathered by sun and wind, but there was integrity in the set of his jaw, in the directness of his gaze. It was a desperate gamble, a leap into an even deeper unknown, but it was a hand extended when all others had withdrawn. "Yes," she breathed, the word barely audible, yet it sealed her fate. "Yes, Sheriff Thorne." The ceremony was a blur. The fading sun cast long, distorted shadows as Sheriff Thorne led her not to a church, but to the small, clapboard office of Judge Abernathy, a man whose spectacles seemed permanently perched on the end of his nose. The judge, clearly bewildered but perhaps accustomed to the sheriff's decisive ways, mumbled through the briefest of vows. Alara's responses were faint, her hand, when Caleb Thorne took it to slip on a plain, unadorned band he'd procured from somewhere, was trembling. It wasn't cold, like the November air that had stolen her parents, but calloused and strong, engulfing hers. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. The shame of Croft's rejection still burned, now overlaid with the sheer unreality of this. Married. To a man whose name she'd known for less than an hour. His dwelling was attached to the sheriff's office, two small, sparse rooms that smelled of dust, old paper, and strong coffee. A narrow bed in one room, a table and two chairs in the other, a cold stove. There were no curtains on the single window, no softness anywhere. It was the abode of a solitary man, functional and unadorned. He gestured towards the bed. "You can take this room." He didn't say where he would sleep. Probably the hard cot in the jail cell next door, she thought with a fresh wave of unease. The silence between them stretched, taut and awkward. Alara placed her carpetbag on the floor, the only feminine touch in the stark room. She felt his gaze on her back, not unkind, but observant. She was intensely aware of her height, of how she must dwarf the small furnishings, how out of place she must seem. "There's food in the pantry," he said finally, his voice neutral. "Such as it is. I'll be in the office." He retreated, leaving her alone with the echoing vows and the suffocating quiet. The first few days were a torment of uncertainty. Alara cleaned the small quarters with a fierce energy, scrubbing away at the grime as if she could scrub away her own discomfort. She cooked, simple meals from the limited supplies, leaving his portion on the table, never knowing if he ate it. He was a shadow, a quiet presence at the edges of her new, surreal life. He slept, she discovered, on a rolled-up blanket on the floor of the main office, giving her the privacy of the bedroom. The gesture, unspoken, was a small knot of warmth in the cold dread that gripped her. The town of Redemption Gulch watched. She felt their eyes when she ventured out to the mercantile for supplies, her height marking her as clearly as if she wore a sign. Whispers followed her like tumbleweeds. The sheriff's giantess. Croft was right, she's a tall one. Poor Thorne, what was he thinking? Each whisper was a fresh jab, reinforcing Silas Croft's cruel assessment. Elara kept her gaze down, her shoulders hunched, trying to make herself smaller, an impossible task. Sheriff Thorne never commented on the whispers, nor on her attempts to make their shared space more habitable. He ate what she cooked, a quiet, much obliged, ma'am, his only comment. He was out for long hours, patrolling, dealing with the town's minor squabbles and occasional dangers. When he returned, he would nod to her, his face tired, and settle down with paperwork or simply sit, staring out the window, lost in thoughts she couldn't guess. One evening, driven by a desperate need to fill the silence, she spoke. Sheriff Thorne. Caleb. His head turned slowly. Why did you do it? He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes shadowed in the lamplight. Town like this, ain't kind to a woman alone. You needed a roof. Protection. But, to marry me? He shrugged, a small movement of his shoulders. Seemed the simplest way. Cut through the talk. Gave you standing. He paused. And Silas Croft needed to be shown he couldn't just discard a person like unwanted freight. It wasn't a declaration of affection, or even companionship. It was pragmatic, almost cold. Yet, there was a gruff sort of kindness in it, a defense of her dignity she hadn't expected. Slowly, a fragile routine began to form. She learned the rhythms of his days, the way he liked his coffee, strong and black, the weary line that settled between his brows when the town was restless. He, in turn, seemed to become accustomed to her presence, to the smell of baking bread that sometimes filled the small rooms, a scent entirely new to his bachelor existence. One afternoon, Silas Croft swaggered into the mercantile while Elara was there. He caught sight of her reaching for a tin of coffee on a high shelf, something no other woman in town could do without a stool or assistance. Well, well, Croft sneered, his voice carrying. If it ain't the sheriff's beanpole. Still reaching for things other folks can't, are ya? Suppose Thorne finds that useful, eh? The familiar burn of shame rose in Elara's cheeks. The storekeeper looked away, embarrassed. Before Elara could stammer a reply, or shrink away as she usually did, Caleb Thorne's quiet voice came from the doorway. He hadn't been there a moment before. She can reach it because she's tall, Croft. Same way you can reach into your pockets to pay your debts. His voice was mild, but his eyes were chips of ice. Something you seem to have trouble with lately, I hear. Croft's face reddened. He knew the sheriff was aware of his overdue accounts. Just making an observation, Sheriff. Make your observations elsewhere, Thorne said, his gaze unwavering. Mrs. Thorne is my wife. Any disrespect to her is disrespect to me. And you know how I feel about disrespect. Croft, for all his bluster, was a coward. He mumbled something unintelligible and scurried out. Elara stared at Thorne, her heart pounding. Asterisk Mrs. Thorne. Asterisk he'd called her his wife, publicly, possessively. And he'd defended her, not just her situation, but her. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't drawn a weapon, but his quiet words had been more effective than any threat. That evening, the silence in their quarters felt different. Less strained, more thoughtful. As she served him his stew, their hands brushed. A jolt, unexpected and surprisingly potent, shot up her arm. She saw a flicker in his eyes before he looked down at his plate. Thank you, Elara, he said, using her given name for the first time without the formal, ma'am, attached. A small thing, yet it felt monumental. Elara began to hold her head a little higher. The whispers didn't vanish, but they seemed to lose some of their sting. She found small ways to contribute. Mrs. Henderson, the kind, elderly woman who ran the small bakery, sprained her wrist. Elara, seeing her struggle to knead dough, offered to help. Her height, her long arms, gave her an unexpected leverage and strength. Soon, she was a regular fixture in the early mornings, her hands dusted with flour, the scent of yeast and cinnamon clinging to her clothes. The children of the town, initially wary, began to greet her with shy smiles, unconcerned with her stature. One small boy, Timmy, couldn't reach a bright red apple hanging high on the tree behind the church. Elara, with a smile, plucked it down for him effortlessly. His delighted grin was a balm to her spirit. She started to see Caleb not just as a sheriff or a rescuer, but as a man. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when something amused him, a rare but genuine sight. She saw the quiet exhaustion he carried, the weight of responsibility for an often unruly town. She saw his patience with a distraught farmer whose cow had wandered, his stern but fair justice with a drunken brawler. One blustery evening, a fierce storm rolled in, the wind howling like a hungry wolf, rattling the windows of their small home. Rain lashed down in sheets. Caleb was late. Hours late. Elara paced the small room, her anxiety a tight knot in her chest. The fire in the stove sputtered, casting dancing shadows. Every gust of wind sounded like a door slamming, a horse falling. She imagined him out there, caught in the deluge, perhaps injured. The door finally burst open, and Caleb stumbled in, soaked to the bone, his face grim. He was supporting a younger man, one of the deputies, whose arm was bound in a bloodied makeshift sling. "Jedediah took a fall," Caleb said, his voice strained. "Horse spooked by lightning. Arms broken, I think. And he's feverish." Without a word, Elara flew into action. She helped Caleb ease the injured deputy onto the narrow bed, her bed. She fetched water, tore strips from one of her few good petticoats for cleaner bandages. Her height, usually a source of awkwardness, allowed her to support Jedediah's weight as Caleb expertly resplinted the arm. Her hands, usually so self-conscious, were steady as she bathed the young man's fevered brow. All through the night, she and Caleb worked together, a silent, efficient team. They took turns watching over Jedediah, forcing sips of willow bark tea between his lips. In the small, cramped space, they moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, a rhythm born of shared purpose. Towards dawn, the fever broke. Jedediah fell into a healing sleep. Elara sagged against the wall, exhausted but relieved. Caleb stood beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. The weariness on his face was profound, but as he looked at her, there was a new light in his eyes. "You did good, Elara," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Real good." "We did," she corrected softly, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she didn't feel like an imposition, an obligation he'd undertaken. She felt like a partner. The incident with Jedediah shifted something fundamental between them. The barriers of awkwardness and necessity had been breached by shared crisis and mutual reliance. The town, too, saw her differently. They'd seen her competence, her compassion. The whispers didn't entirely cease, but their nature changed. "The sheriff's wife, she's got a good head on her shoulders. Tall as she is, she's got a gentle touch." Silas Croft, however, remained a festering sore. His business had suffered since Thorne's quiet rebuke, and his resentment towards both the sheriff and Elara had only deepened. He saw their growing accord, the subtle shift in the town's perception, and it galled him. One afternoon, as Elara walked back from the bakery, her arms laden with freshly baked bread, Croft blocked her path, a sneer on his face. "Playing the dutiful wife, are we?" he said, his voice oily. "Don't fool yourself. Thorne only married you out of pity. Or maybe," he leaned closer, his breath foul, "he has a peculiar taste for curiosities. Once the novelty wears off, he'll tire of you, just like I knew I would. Elara froze. The old shame, the familiar sting of his words, threatened to overwhelm her. But then, she thought of Caleb's steady gaze, his quiet defense, the way they had worked together through the storm. She straightened to her full height, looking down at the smaller man. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "Sheriff Thorne is a man of honor. Something you clearly know nothing about. What he feels, or doesn't feel, is between him and me. It is certainly none of your concern." Croft's face purpled. "Why, you overgrown. Is there a problem here, Croft?" Caleb's voice, like the snap of a whip, cut him off. He'd come up behind Elara, silent as smoke. His hand rested lightly on the butt of his Colt, not a threat, but a statement. Croft sputtered, "Just having a word with your wife." "I heard the word," Caleb said, his eyes like chips of flint. "And I didn't like its tone." "Elara," he turned to her, his expression softening fractionally, "go on home. I'll handle Mr. Croft." Elara hesitated, then met his gaze. There was a silent command there, but also a reassurance. She nodded, a newfound trust settling within her. She walked away, her head held high, not looking back, though she could feel the tension crackling in the air behind her. She didn't know what Caleb said to Croft, but when the merchant emerged from the alleyway later, he was pale and visibly shaken, and he never bothered Elara, or spoke ill of her or the sheriff in public again. That evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the vast prairie sky, Elara stood by the window of their small kitchen, watching the colors change. The sparse rooms no longer felt like a cage, but a haven. She heard Caleb enter, the familiar sound of his boots on the wooden floor. He came to stand beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of unspoken understanding. "He won't trouble you again," Caleb said finally, his voice quiet. "Thank you," she whispered. She turned to face him, truly face him, her gaze open and direct. "Caleb, why?" It was the old question, but this time it held a different weight, a different hope. "Why did you really marry me?" He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. The stern lines of his face seemed to soften in the dim light. "When I saw you standing there, after Croft shamed you. I saw strength, Elara. Not just in your height, but in your spirit. You faced it. You didn't crumble." He paused, a rare hesitance in his voice. "This town, this life, it's hard. Solitary. I reckon I was tired of being solitary." His gaze dropped to her hands, then lifted back to her eyes. "And you ain't what I expected, Elara Stone. You're more." Her breath caught. "More." He thought she was more. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. It wasn't a lover's caress, not yet, but it was a touch of profound tenderness, of acknowledgement. Of belonging. Elara leaned into his touch, a small, instinctive movement. Her own hand came up to cover his. The setting sun cast their elongated shadows across the floor, two figures no longer separate, but joined in the quiet intimacy of the fading day. The shame of her height, the sting of rejection, began to recede, replaced by a tentative, burgeoning warmth. Their destinies, set on a new course by an abrupt, unlikely marriage before sunset, were now irrevocably intertwined, not by mere necessity, but by a slowly dawning, quietly powerful truth. She looked up at him, a true smile finally reaching her eyes. He returned it, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips, but it was enough. It was everything. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe for more.